Now, as I mentioned, the parties will have 20 minutes each. We start with the office of the prosecutor. Mr. Prosecutor, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Mr. President, Your Honours, it's a real privilege to address you and address this chamber for the first time as prosecutor. One must start, of course, with recalling the resilience, the courage, and indeed the patience of the survivors, the witnesses, and the victims who have courageously come forward to the office to give very difficult accounts upon which we rely to support this case and commend it to go to trial. The fact that we are here today should not be taken as a given. The last few months of 2019, the investigations being conducted by the office were suspended because of want of resources. Then, of course, the investigations and the work was affected, like the rest of the world, by the worldwide pandemic that continues to today. But the fact we are here today is a result of partnerships, that enough good people, enough people desirous of telling the truth, have banded together to ensure that allegations can be subjected to due process and to be determined by independent and impartial judges. That's the beauty of this system and this court in whose premises I have the honour to stand. Significant thanks must be given to not just survivors and victims, they're in the first category, but also to international organisations, NGOs, and I think it's right to say first and foremost to the national authorities of the Central African Republic. It was a desire for accountability that led the Central African Republic to refer this situation to the court back on the 30th of May 2014. And Your Honour, with greatest of respect, a great deal of credit goes to Your Honour and this pre-trial chamber, that in the less than 10 months since Mr. Said was arrested, a very well-structured set of proceedings have been put in place to allow, consistent with the presumption of innocence, the allegations that I put before this court to be properly scrutinised. Your Honour, Mr. Mohammed Said Abdul Khani, of course, is 51 years of age. We've heard the charges that have been read out against him. And Your Honours, all three of you are very familiar with the agony that was the Central African Republic from 2012 onwards. For those who are not, perhaps I can be permitted to very briefly state what is well known. That President Bouzizi, after almost 1 decade in power, was ousted by the Seleka armed group, which was an amalgam of different factions that came together for that purpose. And the Seleka, mostly Muslims, targeted those that were perceived to be supporters of former President Bouzizi. And they viewed these individuals as perceived supporters on account of various interlacing characteristics. Particularly, the evidence shows, those that were Christians, those that resided in certain parts of Bangui, those that worked in certain professions, those that had been employed by the previous government of President Bouzizi, and also in terms of detentions, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that predominantly men were targeted. These combined intersecting reasons found the charge of persecution contrary to Article 7 1H of the Rome Statute, namely persecution on political, ethnic, religious and gender grounds. But, Mr. President, Your Honours, it was this mistreatment that the Seleka were inflicting, these crimes that we say occurred, that also galvanized the community to create their own structures to defend themselves against those attacks. And in tandem with that, the former forces and elements and supporters of former President Bouazizi reorganized themselves from the DRC and from Cameroon, and then they joined together in inflicting pain and misery on the people of the Central African Republic. Currently, as Your Honours know, before Trial Chamber 5, in the Yakatom and Agasona case, the allegations in relation to what was called the anti-Balaka movement are under consideration. Unfortunately for the people of the Central African Republic, they were also not spared by the Seleka, and this case is but one snapshot, one still picture of a course of criminality that requires review by this chamber. Mr. President, Your Honours, in my respectful submission, and Your Honours will decide in due course, this is as straightforward a case as is likely to come before this court. This is not a case where Your Honours are going to be challenged to look at complicated theories of liability of a military commander or a civilian superior removed from the theatre of conflict. It is a detention case. And we say the evidence overwhelmingly shows that Mr. Said was in the room where it happened. He encouraged it, he facilitated it, but he also took part in beatings and mistreatment that justifies the forms of participation that are put in the document containing charges. People were put in just appalling conditions with no regard for their humanity. Your Honour, the conduct charged is, of course, alleged to be in the course of an armed conflict, not of an international character. And we say Mr. Said knew that his fellow citizens were targeted simply because they were viewed as perceived Bouazizi supporters. That was the singular reason why their humanity was disregarded and their rights violated. He knew that his own conduct was in the context of this armed conflict, and it was in that context that people were being raped, people were being killed and persecuted for that reason. Now, one has to be clear. Mr. Said is not being charged for those murders, for those rapes that are part of the underlying evidence in this case. But it is my respectful submission that he cannot, on any view, plead ignorance. It is important to note that from the evidence in support of these charges, at the time he was overseeing the OCRB, the world was already aware of the rapes taking place. The groans from OCRB and the plaintive cries that are mentioned in the evidence had reached all the way to Geneva and international organizations. An example, perhaps just two, may suffice for the moment. In CIR OTP 2001-1759, at page 1764, Human Rights Watch reports that in May 2013, rapes were alleged to have been committed in Bangui. At the time, Mr. Said is said to have been actively involved in abducting people and interrogating people and helping in the running of the Sedad detention facility. The officer of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva on the 12th of September 2013, in their report, The Situation of Human Rights in the CAR, noted that people were being raped as perceived Bouazizi supporters in Bangui. They quote 7 women being raped in one incident. From another source, 4 women were raped. And in another variety of sources, they mention a 12-year-old girl was raped. Mr. Eric MacDonald will, in due course, and with the leave of the court, flesh out the evidence or highlight evidence that we say is of particular relevance to Your Honour's pending determination. But one thing is clear. In relation to the attacks in April 2013 and August 2013 at Boirabe, the evidence discloses that Mr. Said was present. This was not a well-kept secret. The crimes, the scale, the link to the conflict, and the discriminatory intent was open to everybody, and unfortunately particularly keenly felt by the civilians in the CAR. Mr. President, the OCRB itself was a catalogue of misery. The charges themselves form of odious torture and mistreatment signals the wanton disregard for the sanctity of human life that every individual, regardless of race or religion or ethnic origin, has by virtue of their humanity. And that is the abattoir method of mistreatment. Your Honour, I'm not intending to refer to any confidential information in this hearing, and I would ask perhaps if Your Honours could press evidence 2, and a photograph can be displayed which speaks volumes. This is a survivor, somebody who by the grace and mercy of the Almighty lived to tell the tale. And the wounds one sees on his arms and shoulder, it's P547, are as a result of this abattoir mistreatment, where hands are tied together with ankles and elbows to contort the human body from its natural pose into an extremely painful, debilitating form of cruelty. It was not a restraint. It was deliberately done. Your Honour, so painful was it for P547 that at paragraph 59 of his statement, he states he was so bad, the pain was so excruciating, he asked his tormentors to put him out of his misery and kill him. In relation to the conditions, another photograph speaks far more eloquently than I could ever hope to do. Your Honour will see on the screen 2 pictures. The hole below is the location where many of those unfortunate souls were placed in terrible conditions without toilet, food, or any type of care. Literally standing above them was Mr. Said. We say that room and that area was his office. The evidence discloses that. He used to frequent it. And perhaps it's quite apt that literally standing on their heads, trampling on their dignity, stamping on their rights, he cannot plead ignorance. The smell was awful. The proximity could not have been closer. This is the type of criminality that gave rise to the charges before your honours. When, by the end of August, he was moved from OCRB, his superior, Nuruddin Adam, appointed him to the SEDAD. And this was a facility of the intelligence services of the CAR, which was turned with the assistance, connivance, and actions of Mr. Said to an unofficial detention center. And again, the same type of treatment of arbacha, of beatings or floggings continued. And all of that is in the file. Your Honour's relatives were never informed where their loved ones were. They went missing sometimes for weeks. They didn't know. Some thought they had died, but that agony, that trauma that was inflicted by being held incommunicado is captured in the charge of other inhumane acts. Your Honour, upon commencing my term as prosecutor, I instructed all the senior trial attorneys in the case to certify whether or not their cases gave rise to a realistic prospect of conviction. Mr. Eric MacDonald has so certified. For today's hearing, we say that manifestly the confirmation standard is met. With your leave, the last word, of course, must go to the victims and survivors who've been waiting for these years for some form, some modicum of justice and accountability. I have them, Mr. President, Your Honours, perhaps as many of us do, very much in my mind's eye. I have seen on the court's Twitter account and on the court's web pages different photographs of individuals in different locations following these proceedings. Can I just say that this office and myself pledge to do our best to work closer with the people of the Central African Republic, to develop deeper bonds with them and with the national authorities of the Central African Republic, the specialized court of the CAR, consistent with the principle of complementarity. I have said repeatedly in various fora that the forum of justice is not important. The principle of justice is. But, Your Honours, today, this chamber is the forum, and Your Honours are the judges. And we are confident that after considering all the evidence, you will decide to commit this case to trial. Your Honours, those complete my opening remarks, hopefully within the time limits. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Prosecutor, for your statements. On a general note, since this is, as you mentioned, your first time addressing a chamber in your position, capacity as prosecutor, we wish you and your colleagues success in the accomplishment of the court's mandate. Now, it's 11:01. I will now adjourn the hearing for half an hour. 11:30 we will resume, and we will continue with you, Madam Counsel for the Office of Public Counsel for Victims. So thank you very much, and see you later. Thank you.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.